What's going on, Marks? I am the other Steve, and welcome back to the House of Kayfabe. And I am with the trial chief. I am with the man who is so famous that they named a river after him in his home state, Stephen P. New, and he is going to let me sit by the learning tree because, as the video states, we're going to be talking ICW. Anytime ICW comes up, I am faced with the fact that I was a student of the After Mags. And if you read the After Mags in the 80s, like I did, they only talked about the affiliated promotions. So I know all about the NWA territories, maybe not as much out west. I know about WWE. I even know about AWA and World Class. But Stephen P. New, you are really the only person that I know that watched ICW. Let's assume that if you clicked on this, that you may not be up on that promotion. Give us just a bird's eye view of what ICW was, and then give us the names that came out of ICW, because some huge legends came from this promotion. Steve, how
Sure.
do you know about ICW?
Well, Steve, I've told this story a few times, and people always seem to enjoy it. In Gilbert, West Virginia, in the late '70s, early '80s, there wasn't much to do, right? So it was ride your motorcycle, ride your bicycle, build tree forts, that type thing. Play cops and robbers, play cowboys and Indians, that type of thing. Shoot pellet guns, shoot BB guns. That was my life in the summer, and there would always be a big gang of us boys hanging around, age range anywhere from about 8 to 13. And so I had this friend that was a few years older than me, and every Saturday afternoon at about 2:30, he'd disappear. And so like we'd be in the middle of a game of football or a game of basketball or something, and Ryan would just up and disappear. Well, one day I followed him. I got on my bike and followed him on his bicycle, and he was going to his mom and dad's mobile home and going in and just sweaty, sweat dripping. I just thought, well, maybe he's getting a drink, maybe he's hungry or something. And he goes in, runs over to the television, turns it on Channel 4 out of Oak Hill here, and it's ICW Wrestling,
Which stands
and
for?
with International Championship Wrestling.
Okay.
And it was on WOAY TV4 out of Oak Hill, West Virginia. And the match that was on that he wanted to watch that day in particular was Ronnie Garvin versus Ricky Starr for the Southeast Championship belt.
Okay.
And I remember watching that match, and I remember just being like, wow, this is where you go every Saturday when you disappear. And my friend Ryan was like, well, wait a minute. If you think this stuff is good, stick around to 605. It gets really good.
So is the first wrestling you ever watched ICW?
Yes, the first wrestling I ever watched, the first match I ever watched was an ICW match. So I really got into it. And the funny thing about the cable or the TV line, as we called it in Gilbert, was that we got not only stations from West Virginia, like WOAY TV4, but we also got stations out of Bristol, Tennessee, the Tri-Cities, Bristol, Kingsport, Johnson City. And so ICW showed on a channel out of Bristol as well as on a channel out of Oak Hill, West Virginia. And so that's kind of what really got me into wrestling. And this was ICW, International Championship Wrestling. So for a little bit of background on this, some guys broke off and away from Ron Fuller's Southeastern Championship Wrestling in Knoxville. And Angelo Poffo, the miser, was the owner of ICW, along with his sons, Randy Savage and Leaping Lanny Poffo. And Hustler Rip Rogers had a minority interest, about 5 or 10%. And the one-man gang, Ronnie Garvin, had an ownership interest in the territory of about 5 or 10%. Yeah.
He was
So,
the first one-man gang?
yes, he gave that
Wow.
name to Crusher Broomfield, who went on to be One Man Gang, who went on to be Akeem the African Dream. So we'll talk about all these superstars in just a moment. But Poffo had wanted his own NWA territory and couldn't get one. So he just said, screw it. I'm going to run opposite of these guys and I'm going to make my own territory where I want it to be. And it was really ambitious, Steve. The Poffos were from Illinois. So it went all the way into southern Illinois, southern Indiana. It was based out of Lexington, Kentucky, all the way down into the central part of Middle Tennessee, over to East Tennessee, and then up through Appalachia, Eastern Kentucky, Southern West Virginia, and that kind of little toe of Virginia there, and into East Tennessee. Did not get over into North Carolina. That's a pretty big territory if you think about it. If it's all the way, if it goes from Peoria, Illinois, all the way to Abingdon, Virginia, or Beckley, West Virginia on the easternmost, that's a big territory. They're headquartered out of Lexington. That's where they do their TV. And so for those first couple of years, it was kind of lean, right? They've got lawsuits coming after them by the Fullers, by the Jarretts, and even up in Indiana and Illinois, Dick the Bruiser territory, right? So they kind of get that stuff settled down, and they figure out who's going to be on their roster and where their territory is going to be. But all of that time, you mentioned NWA, AWA, WWF affiliated. ICW was considered an outlaw promotion because they were not an NWA affiliate. So they have this fictional world title tournament, and Randy Savage supposedly beats Leaping Lanny in 1979 for the ICW World Championship in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Oh,
and for real, that was it.
I love wrestling.
So they've got a world champion, and Ronnie Garvin had been the Fuller's Southeastern champion. And when he starts in the ICW, he just takes the belt with him.
Oh. Now, if you are a younger Mark watching this, you would say, oh, well, hey, he just took a belt to another promotion. You do not understand how dire the consequences of something like that could be. Now, as you were just talking about their territory, I know this isn't one of our standard Stephen P. New Law videos, but I do want to ask you this. What knowing about the NWA as we do, about them being an organized group of people who were providing an exclusive product, did someone like ICW have a strong antitrust case to make against the NWA?
If Angelo Poffo had wanted to force that issue, and probably the reason why that territory lasted for 6 years was because the NWA did not want to risk those counter lawsuits alleging antitrust, and that they were all in on the rig, right? That you cannot, just as an organization, say, all right, Crockett's, you control the Carolinas and Virginia, Virginia down to South Carolina, and you so-and-so have Georgia, and, you, Watts, have Mississippi and Louisiana, and you, Von Erich, you've got Texas, a part of Texas, and you, Graham, you've got Florida. Boys, we're going to divvy this up, and we're all going to decide who gets to be champion every couple of years, and da-da-da-da-da, and we're not going to let anybody in on this. So, I mean, that is classic antitrust. I mean,
if you were teaching a class about antitrust, could you just use that story?
I probably would just use the National Wrestling Alliance as my example if I were teaching a law school course on antitrust. It was the reason why none of them griped when Vince McMahon Sr. took the WWF and Gagne took the AWA. What were they going to say? Same thing happened to Ronnie Garvin. He had a boat that the Fullers had bought, and he had their Southeastern Championship belt. The Fullers sued him. They couldn't break kayfabe in court in Knoxville. He said, what were they going to do? Tell the judge, oh, hey, judge, this wasn't real. That boat Ronnie never really won that boat in the tournament that we had in Knoxville a few weekends ago. So he got their boat and their Southeast Championship belt. So that was kind of the beginnings of the ICW. And I want to read just a few names for you, if I can, because it's really, when you look at who their alumni are, it's really pretty astounding, some of the alumni that you hear. You know, when a lot of people think ICW, you think Randy Savage, you think Leaping Lanny, you think Ronnie Garvin, Crusher Broomfield, Pez Whatley, Hustler Rip Rogers. I mean, that's the foundation of it right there. But you had Barry O, who was Bob Orton Jr.'s brother. Bob Orton Jr. was one of the founders of ICW. Bob Root, Boris Malenko, Buddy Landell started out as a job guy in ICW. And Crusher Broomfield, who went on to be the one-man gang, and Akeem, the African Dream. A fellow by the name of Chief Tapu, who, along with the great Tio, they had their own sort of great value brand Samoans in the ICW. Doug Vines and Jeff Sword, called the Devil's Duo, and we'll talk a little bit more about them later. Ernie Ladd, between WWF stints and some others, and before he went to be a booker with Bill Watts, stopped in ICW for a couple of years and had some great matches. A fellow by the name of Gary Royal, who was a hand for a long time, short, blonde guy, and he jobbed for the Crockett's all the way up through the early 90s, did Gary Royal. Great guy. A guy named George Weingroff, whose relatives were tied into the business. Saul Weingroff was another promoter. A manager named Izzy Slapowitz, who managed the Devil's Duo.
Izzy Slap? Did you say Izzy Slapowitz?
Izzy Slapowitz.
I love wrestling.
Was the guy's name. So yeah. And Angelo Poffo, of course, was the owner of ICW. He was the world sit-up champion. He's in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most sit-ups done. And he wrestled under a mask called the Miser. And I mean, the Miser, you know, and he had like dollar bills on his mask. It was hilarious.
And apparently, and I know this because of the God Emperor, because really the most that I know about ICW is when God Emperor Cornette talks about it,
sure.
that was a shoot gimmick, that he was very miserly with his money.
He was very tight with the money. I mean, that was art imitating life. Right there. So Pistol Pez Whatley, we've already talked about. A fella by the name of Ratamius, and he was kind of like a Maniac Mark Lewin type, the Hustler Rip Rogers, Ron Wright, and also the original Sheik would come down from Detroit and wrestle for Poffo every now and then, and they had kind of like talent exchanges. A fella, the first professional wrestler I ever met in my life was a guy named Hoot Gibson from Lebanon, Virginia. And Big Boy Williams.
Is that where Robert Gibson gets his nickname?
I don't know how many Hoot Gibsons or how they get those nicknames or whatever. Now, I'm going to give you another name, and this is very interesting because she was like a weather girl or on a news station in Lexington, Elizabeth Hewlett. And Liz Hewlett started out as a TV personality there in Lexington. Eventually, she started hanging around the TV studio where they were doing the TV tapings, and nobody's going to resist Randy Savage's charisma, you know. And so the rest, as we know, is history. But man, it was really great, old school, old style wrestling. You clearly knew who the good guys were, and you clearly knew who the bad guys were. And you know, Cornette likes to laugh. Those first couple years in the TV studios, you know, those weren't very big, even with Georgia Championship Wrestling and World Championship Wrestling before they went to the arena style tapings. What was just there inside the studio, but with ICW there was like one row of guys, and Poffo was so miserly they had like a painted crowd.
No,
yes,
like a pandemic crowd for baseball.
Yes, it looked like a pandemic crowd for baseball, or something you'd see in like a junior high musical theater number. Like if you were trying to make a set piece, you know, of what a crowd at a sporting event should look like. And some of their job guys were told, hey, just put on a hat or something and go out and you make up the front row. And then we're going to put these dummy guys on the rows behind you. I mean, times were lean when they started out, but about the time that I started watching it in '81, it started to get really good, and they'd run a large number of shows. If they ran West Virginia, they would run Beckley like the last Thursday of every or every other Thursday or something like that, where they were in Beckley every time.
Was this at the Armory?
That was at the Armory, where the Bash and Beckley will be on June 17th, by the way. Mm-hmm. Same building. And but what they would do, and a lot of people I think use these terms interchangeably, house show and spot show. They're not the same thing. A house show is, I mean, any show can be a house show. It's just something that's not televised. But a spot show is somewhere where you don't run regularly. And what Poffo would like to do was, if they were going to run Beckley, they'd find out where else they could run close to that. So they might run Oceana, Logan, Madison, wow, Roncevert. So they'd knock out like 5 West Virginia towns all in the same week or two.
And this would have been like at the local high schools, right?
Either high schools or, I mean, with West Virginia, they were lucky. They got armories. And Beckley, you know, the Armory looks the same now. It seats 2,500 people. And Rip Rogers says that was one of their best places, the Madison Civic Center, where you're from, Steve. That's yes, where ASW runs All-Star Wrestling, Gary Dameron. That's All-Star Wrestling's home arena right there. And there was an Armory in Logan at Monaville, which is where I first did National Guard. There was an Armory in Roncevert. So if you got those, and then the high school in Oceana, that was where they would run in West Virginia. And similar things, Lebanon, Abingdon, Bristol, Johnson City, that would give them 4 towns real close together down there in Southwest Virginia, East Tennessee. And they would try to run like that. And they bicycled those friggin' tapes, man. Poffo would send those guys out driving. You know, they'd record and then they'd send those tapes out, you know, and they'd give them like 4 weeks worth of tapes. And that's what WWE has now. But I want to talk about
explain that real quick, though. Explain
sure.
that, you know, WWE, I guess we are going to make an assumption that because Lanny Poffo has unfortunately shuffled off this mortal coil, that they now had and really, when you think about it, that's like the last promotion, it feels like, that the WWE does not have. And now they have bought the promotion that made you a lifetime wrestling fan.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, everybody wondered for all these years, and Lanny never would answer, where are the tapes? Where are the masters? You know, who has them? Nobody's seen them, that kind of thing. And lo and behold, either by virtue of sale or he bequeathed them in the will or whatever, but the WWE now is considered to be the owner of ICW wrestling, at least as it relates to the tapes. Now, you and I did a recording for your podcast not too long ago talking about the Ed Sheeran trial. By the way, I think I was right. I predicted that Ed Sheeran would win that. And I said that I wanted that if I were trying it, I would want to be Ed Sheeran's lawyer. And so to talk about, when WWE owns something, if they don't own the music, it really kind of changes the dynamic. And ICW had this great intro montage. The intro montage was frequently better than the matches that you would see in the hour-long program, because you got to see Crusher Broomfield fight a bear. You got to see Ronnie Garvin wrestle Andre the Giant. That was probably some footage from Canada. But you got to see the Sheik throw fire into somebody's face and burn them. It was just a really great opening montage, and I encourage anyone to look up the ICW opening credits. But the music to that was the same as the Midnight Express.
Chase
by Giorgio Moroder from the movie The Midnight Express about a Turkish prison. If you've never seen The Midnight Express, go watch that movie. It's very disturbing. But anyway, that was the intro music for ICW. And Randy Savage is one of the first wrestlers who had come to the ring music. And it was Fame by Irene Cara.
Oh, I was thinking David Bowie.
No, Fame by Irene Cara. Fame.
Like the bad movie? I'm going to live forever?
Same name in 1980 about aspiring Broadway actresses like my daughter. And, I just thought that fit Randy Savage so well. Fame, I'm going to live forever. And darned if he isn't. So,
he was right.
Now, some of the better angles, I had this guy who wrestled in ICW who was the quintessential heel, Ox Baker. And there had been this, fight in Cleveland where he and Ernie Ladd and the fans stormed the ring. There was the god-awfulest brawl in the world with Ox Baker fighting Ernie Ladd in Cleveland, Ohio. But Ox Baker had the dreaded heart punch, and he had supposedly killed a man, given a man a heart attack with the heart punch. And so it scared me to death as a kid. He apparently was just this big, lovable teddy bear behind the scenes, but he scared, bald and a big black mustache. He just looked evil with a name like Ox Baker. And one day they were in the ring doing promos, and Ox Baker lost his dentures. So Ronnie Garvin comes out and gets his dentures, and he stomps them in two. And so Baker plays it up like he can't afford another plate of dentures for like 4 or 5 weeks on ICW television. He comes out gumming. And I just remember thinking, that man's really mad. My grandpa wore dentures, and I was like, that man's really mad that Ronnie Garvin stomped his dentures into. And another one, you can look this one up on YouTube as well. Ronnie Garvin broke kayfabe on one of the shows, and he came out. He was chasing Randy. He was the Southeast champion. He was chasing Randy Savage, and he was trying to get in Savage's head. And he teased this for a couple weeks. They had this big secret, and he comes out and he goes, "Your name is not Randy Savage. Your name is Randy Popo, and you're Lanny's brother. Lanny told me that you're his." And Savage comes out, and they've got to be torn apart. And Ronnie Garvin had a picture of Randy and Lanny younger. And it was this whole thing. So
real life conflict that leads to a real life fight. Wrestling.
Yeah.
Wrestling.
Yeah. And so, Ronnie was just putting it out there. But Dusty Rhodes always said anything that comes out of a box gets over.
Mm-hmm.
They had Crusher Broomfield in like this 6'4" box that was made out of plywood. Week after week after week after week, Randy Savage just kept saying, "I got something for you. One man gang, Ronnie Garvin. It's the equalizer." And it just said CB on the outside of this box. And it was Crusher Broomfield. And he comes out and he's green as grass, but he's freaking about 6'6" and about 400 pounds. So there wasn't nobody, going to tell the Crusher Broomfield nothing. Leaping Lanny was a great athlete. Hustler Rip Rogers was fantastic. And with Pistol Pez Watley, they had an angle once where the loser of the match between him and Ronnie Garvin had to wear a mop on their head. So Pistol Pez Watley was called Mophead Watley for, I don't know, it seemed like for a year they called him Mophead Watley. But there was all kinds of that, of those kinds of matches. They even had their own knockoff kabuki.
Okay.
Spelled Kabooki.
Oh, no, just straight the name spelled differently.
Right, just the name spelled differently.
And I know that Gary Hart would not have appreciated that.
No, brother, he would not have. But that guy was apparently this Filipino wrestler who'd been around for ages and everybody loved. So it was quintessential small town, good guy, bad guy pro wrestling. I mean, in its essence. But they ran out of steam in about 84. And Steve, we've talked about this a couple years ago. Jerry Jarrett came here and grilled at my house. That's when I was sponsoring his and Rock Parsons' Roku channel, and they showed some ICW matches on that. And Jerry Jarrett said that when ICW folded, and there was real life heat between those guys.
We're going to get into that with my next question.
Yeah, like Bill Dundee would show up at the Henry Clay High School, and the ICW guys, Randy Savage, would show up where the Memphis guys were wrestling. And so, but Jarrett told me that Randy came to him kind of hat in hand and said, "Look, I still want to try to make it to the upper echelons of the sport. Kind of no harm, no foul. Will you forgive us for all this crap we've done for 6 years running opposite you?" And Jarrett took him in and said, "Hey, I think we can make some money. You guys have been talking this trash. You've been saying for years that you're better than Jerry Lawler. Let's make some money off of it." And Lanny go to Memphis. Crusher Broomfield, I think, as a one-man gang, goes to World Class.
I was going to say, I think he goes to Texas, right?
Yeah, and Ronnie Garvin, I think, goes to Georgia and then to somewhere else, and then comes into the Carolinas, and has obviously a world championship run in him in the Carolinas. So did Pistol Pez Watley, part of Paul Jones' Army. Mm-hmm. But Jarrett was just highly, highly complimentary of Lanny and Randy both, in the way they conducted themselves when they came to Memphis.
Well, earlier you talked, and you've now gave us a couple different towns and cities that they've ran. And I think if you think about ICW and who they brawled with, I guess the other promotion, we think of Continental, but it seems like they were running a lot of different territories, places. Because like when you say Southern West Virginia, I know for a fact, because I saw those shows, that was Jim Crockett Promotions area. That wasn't Continental. You say Cleveland, it seems like Cleveland would have been the Sheik's territory. So were they just stepping on everybody's toes?
They were stepping on everybody's toes. And of course, the Sheik had started, Detroit had started to go down. And that's about the time that Georgia was running Ohio and Michigan.
I didn't know they came that far north.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, Georgia Championship Wrestling was coming as far as Michigan and Ohio, and coming up the western side of West Virginia, Williamson, Logan, Huntington.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The other side of it, Charleston, Beckley, Bluefield, was more Crockett. The western side of it was Georgia. And so, but yeah, the Poffos just ran wherever they wanted to run, wherever they could make the most money.
And if you are a younger Mark watching this, you just can't understand the seriousness of that, because the NWA was basically the mob. And if all these stories are to be believed, they had some mob-like tactics from time to time, and it had to take a big set of balls to say, I'm going to go up against the NWA that runs everything from Australia to Japan to most of America. And the Poffos, they must be a bold bunch if we can judge them by Randy the Macho Man Savage. If that was, if that boldness came from their father, we can assume that had to be such a stressful situation for the Poffos to be in at all times.
I think
they were beset on all sides.
I think they just wanted it that bad. Angelo had been a championship wrestler. He had been a top guy in Illinois and Indiana. And I think he just wanted a piece of the action. He thought that he deserved his own territory, and that, being rebuked by the NWA, hey, that's what he thought. Look, I've got two sons here. This is going to be their business, and I'm going to teach it to them. And we're going to get a few other guys. Speaking of, when Roop and Malenko and Orton and Garvin could not get a piece of the action like Lawler had in Memphis, they cut this video. If you have never watched the Plan B, which is what those guys planned to do, they planned to burn down the professional wrestling industry in about 1978 or 79 and release a video. There was no YouTube. Hell, people didn't even have VCRs in the late 70s. So I don't know to whom they thought they would release this video, but they cut about a 25-minute promo where they expose the business. They tell how it's done. They explain this mafia-like, organization known as the NWA when they couldn't get an ownership piece of it themselves. And so, there was a reason why those guys had to wrestle. They couldn't wrestle anywhere else for a few years.
Is that video available?
Yes. You just YouTube search Garvin Malenko Plan B.
Okay.
And it will come up. But it's a very entertaining video to watch by some guys that you can tell are just pissed off that they can't get an ownership interest in a territory somewhere. I mean, they just think, hey, we know what we're doing here, and we're probably smarter than the Fullers, but, we're not tied in. We don't have probably smarter than the Goulises in Nashville, but we can't get a break. We can't get an ownership interest in a territory anywhere. All right, well, we're going to start our own, and we're just going to burn the whole thing down. It's a very interesting video.
I'm watching that tonight while I'm editing this video. So you probably answered my question there. You would have thought that these guys that were in this outlaw promotion, they weren't a mud show, but they were definitely outlaw, would have been blacklisted. Is it a testament to their talent that they just had to be used after stepping on everyone's territory? Is it one of those situations?
Yeah, I think it's one of those situations. I've heard Hustler Rip Rogers and others say that for Pez Whatley, it was a race issue, and that he felt like he got better exposure and more respect in ICW as a champion African-American athlete coming out of the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. Ronnie Garvin wanted a piece of the action. He felt like he had a great wrestling mind. He felt like he was a really good player coach in terms of talent development, things like that. Same thing with Hustler Rip Rogers. There was a reason why he had a piece of, albeit a small piece, but a piece nonetheless of ICW. He was kind of like a player coach. He helped bring some of these younger guys along and help book the matches. But man, they kept it simple. It was Randy Savage versus Ronnie Garvin or Leaping Lanny, and it would be a tag team. The Great Tapu or Chief Tapu and the Great T.O. versus somebody, and then they usually get 4 to 6 local guys to round out the card, and there wasn't much switching it up in terms of what the matches were or anything like that. I'm sure these guys were in the same matches in just different towns and things like that till they could do those in their sleep.
Would you say that this is a true statement that what was the miser's name again?
Angelo Poffo.
That Angelo Poffo saw Vince McMahon Jr.'s vision before he did and just wasn't able to pull it off at the same scale? Was he the first? And I know that we've heard about Mud Show, especially if you're a Cornette listener, but it seems like it's ICW was the biggest one of the unaffiliated with NWA, WWF, and AWA, and World Class was still NWA at that time.
Right.
They hadn't shot off from the NWA. Was the ICW the biggest of the outside NWA promotions?
Right. I don't know of any others that would have been any bigger than ICW, both in terms of talent roster and a geographic area.
And TV did a lot of non-NWA affiliates, because that's something else I wondered. Did the NWA have a way to monopolize the television? Did they go into a market and say, okay, this is our TV for whoever has this territory, and none other television stations will be considered?
Well, not really, because the NWA would have their deal with whatever TV station was carrying them. In Bluefield, it was WVVA. That's who showed Mid-Atlantic. That was on my TV. But for instance, so what Poffo would do is he would find out who was in that market. Okay, NWA shows on WVVA TV6 in Bluefield, Beckley, Oak Hill. All right, I'm going to go to WOAY. I'm going to go to the ABC affiliate and see if they'll carry me. Well, WOAY had this long history of Saturday night big time wrestling with Shirley Love, and they did their own TV studio wrestling out of Oak Hill. It's kind of a unique West Virginia bit of pro wrestling history. Really? And WOAY said, yeah, put us on. Right, we'll put you on ICW. Same thing in the Tri-Cities. You had WCYB, Channel 5, and the Crockett's were from the Tri-Cities area originally. So that was they may have even owned a TV station in the Tri-Cities area. And so Channel 5 showed the Crockett's. Well, boom, go right across town to Johnson City, go on Channel 11, Poffos. So, and in Lexington, same thing. I heard Cornette talking about this. Jarrett was on one station in Lexington and Louisville. Poffo was just on the other stations.
So we're also going to use this video as an announcement. And when I told the wife that you were doing this, she said, Stephen P's a writer. And I said, sweetheart, all attorneys are writers. Stephen P. New, give the good people your announcement. And I know how fired up you are about this.
Yeah, I have been asked to contribute to a book that's in the development stages right now. We're just kind of putting the outlines together. Hustler Rip Rogers, obviously, an icon in pro wrestling. He's trained a lot of the greatest wrestlers in the world, longtime staple in the business. And Hustler called me up the other day and said, hey, do you want to help us write a book about ICW? And I said, I'd love nothing more. He said, I've heard you tell that story about it being your first match. I know your love of business and ICW in particular, and we'd love to tell for you to tell some stories about going to the house shows in Beckley and Logan, and all that ICW wrestling you watched between 81 and 84. And I told him that I'd love to. I mean, that's a dream come true, because you're certainly not thinking when you're a teenager watching pro wrestling and getting into it and believing that the good guy, believing that it's real. Number one, they're really hurting each other. And number two, that the good guys should always win and the bad guys should always lose. And, you just never dream that you'll fast forward 40 years later and be contributing to a book about that wrestling territory.
2 questions. Will it beat writing briefs? And how many times did he say the F word when he was asking you about writing?
Well, I'll take the second question first there, Your Honor. Hustler Rip Rogers gives Corny a run for his money where profanity is concerned. And I love him. He is a great guy. And anything beats writing briefs. I'll tell you that. So,
well, man, I have enjoyed listening, and man, I found out some new stuff today. And kids, you know what I was thinking about this the other day, Steve? What do you think about this? I always tell in my real life, I'm a drum teacher, and I always tell my students that I am the last generation, me and you, because we're both Gen Xers, or the last generation that grew up without computers. We grew up without social media. If you were lucky, you had a Commodore 64 that you plugged into a cassette player, and maybe you had a Tandy TL2000 from the Radio Shack. I mean, you definitely weren't online. We are also the last generation. When you brought this up just now, we have kayfabe. We grew up thinking Santa Claus was still real, and he is, kids. That affects the way that we like wrestling, and it really does make us the get off my lawn guys. Because when we see stuff like, I'm not going to name any promotions, Derek, doing shit without any regards to trying to make this shit look real, it is offensive to us.
Or like when Kevin Owens, who still hasn't birthed that baby, by the way, when Kevin Owens says, "This is the part where you do this," come on, I mean, why don't you just hold the script in your hand there, Mr. Steen, and read from it while you're out there? If you're going to say, well, this is the part where this happens, or this is the part where your music comes on and you run in the, I mean, this was, this didn't have nearly the production value, but it really was sweet. I knew who the bad guys were, and I knew who the good guys were, and I knew who I needed to cheer for. And,
and they made you believe.
Yeah.
And when wrestling makes you believe, it is operating in the way that it should. And that's 2 old marks telling you that. If y'all like what we're doing here, please give us a like, a comment, and share. Hell, tell your friends about us. We're building a brand around these parts. And, kids, go out and go past 10 years ago. More importantly, go past the Attitude Era and go find
the Monday Night Wars.
And the Monday Night Wars. And because you are missing out on some of the best wrestling that's ever happened. So good that we have 2 people that are in our 40s, we won't say how far into them, who were birthed wrestling fans under those conditions. And here we sit today in 2023, still talking about this wonderful sport of wrestling.
And Steve, I've got another offer. This is how widespread. I hope this video gets shared, Steve. And when you come down to Beckley in a couple of weeks, I'll hook you up, my friend. Like I always try to hook you up on some sweet stuff. But I have a CD, a DVD of ICW wrestling that a former client of mine made for me. And if anybody watching this video wants a copy of this ICW wrestling video, and it's got a lot of those great angles, it's a mix of it literally is the best of ICW. Just message me on social media, message House of Kayfabe, say, hey, Steve, I want one of those videos, and I'll get it made for you and shipped off to you.
That's how good of a dude he is. He just wants to give the gift of markish wrestling. Thank you, Stephen P. New. We'll see you all next time. Well, we're going to do a preview of the Bash in Beckley that's going to be going on June 17th. Tickets are still available. Just search for All Star Wrestling. We got Heath from Impact, and he's going to be taking on the dastardly Matt Cardona for the ASW World Championship
in a cage
title in a cage. The first time the ASW has ever been in a cage. And of course, that's not this video. So watch that one. We'll see you all next time.